Hi, and welcome back to the Fair Mormon Conference with our next speakers. We have Bruce and Brian Dale, and both of them have PhDs, so obviously education runs in the family. Bruce Dale has degrees in chemical engineering, and Brian Dale is a biomedical engineer, and they have a wonderful presentation for us today. So they're not with us in the room, but I'm going to turn the time over to them. Go ahead.
We really appreciate the opportunity to present our work here today. It's a long title, and not necessary to go ahead and repeat it, but we're going to show you that Joseph Smith is without any doubt the world's greatest guesser. So this work is based on, our presentation is based on a paper we published in Interpreter a little over a year ago with this same title. It's going on 110 pages, so there's lots of detail in there. We won't cover anything but a small fraction of that detail. I'm your first presenter. This is me. I typically wear a hat. I want you to be able to recognize me if you see me wandering on the streets of Provo. I will present the start, why we started this study, the kind of the background for it. Then Brian, who's the true expert here in the Bayesian statistics, will tell a little bit about Bayesian statistical methods. Then I'll take over the presentation again and show you how we apply Bayesian methods to a comparison of the Book of Mormon and Dr. Michael Coe's book, the Maya, and then a couple of control books. Okay, so first question is, what are correspondences? Since that's an important part of the title. There are connections, commonalities, conformities, correlations, you know the list here. And of course the dread word parallel here. A little bit more about parallel in just a moment. But they're points of evidence. And when you see a correspondence or a conformity, the details line up. They fit with each other. Okay? Question is, how well? Well, parallelomania, or the drawing of parallels, has been justly criticized. We would like to explain to you why this is not parallelomania. First, we start with a very strong skeptical prior hypothesis, which is part of the Bayesian methods, and Brian will speak more about it. But we start with prior odds of 1 billion to 1 that the Book of Mormon is fiction, a lie, that it is what its enemies claim it to be, a lie. We then assemble both positive and negative correspondences, or points of evidence, from both Michael Coe's book, the Maya, and the Book of Mormon, all of them, all the positive and negative correspondences that we can find. We use Bayesian methods to weight, because not all evidence is equally strong. We weight both the positive and the negative points of evidence. And then we calculate the posterior odds using the weighted positive and negative evidence. In other words, we start with a prior hypothesis, we evaluate the evidence both for and against, and then calculate a new hypothesis. We do a sensitivity analysis to determine how robust our conclusions are. In other words, if you change your assumptions, change the data, how much do the conclusions change? We also test the Maya versus 2 control books, and we'd like here to thank the reviewers for making this suggestion. I want to give them great thanks for making me read both Manuscript found and View of the Hebrews a half a dozen times each, and together those 2 control books. So we test the Maya versus the 2 control books. And this is again why it's not parallelomania, because we have these controls. We're seeing how strong the evidence is. Parallelomaniacs do none of these things. They just don't approach it this way. They're only interested in positive parallels. So we think this is the first attempt to use Bayesian methods to evaluate a specific body of evidence for and against the Book of Mormon. Okay, we compare facts stated in these 2 books. This is our body of evidence. We compare the Book of Mormon, another testament of Jesus Christ, with the 9th edition of Dr. Michael Coe's book, the Maya. And Dr. Coe was, he passed away a year and a half ago, a critic, a fairly vocal critic of the Book of Mormon. Here is some of his criticism. This is the 1973 dialogue article he wrote about Mormons and archaeology. Quoting Dr. Coe, "The picture of this hemisphere between 2000 BC and AD 421, as presented in the book, in other words, the Book of Mormon, has little to do with early Indian cultures as we know them, in spite of much wishful thinking." Of course, the wishful thinkers are those who believe the Book of Mormon to be an authentic book. In other words, you and me. Okay. Much more recently, Dr. Coe, in a series of podcast interviews, said 99% of everything that the Book of Mormon has as details is false. Okay, so there's a lot of detail in the Book of Mormon. There's a lot of detail in his book, the Maya. And we line those up. We compare those. Those are powerful condemnations of the Book of Mormon, actually, to say, Dr. Cole. That's pretty strong language. The 99% of the details are false. Those might be valid or important or meaningful criticisms, but Dr. Cole actually knew much about the Book of Mormon, but he did not. Okay? He was almost completely ignorant of the Book of Mormon. He didn't know the details. Therefore, he could not compare the details because he didn't know them. In one of the podcasts, in fact, he seemed surprised that there were wars in the Book of Mormon. We're now hip deep in the war chapters in the Book of Mormon. It's kind of surprising that he missed that, but he did. He did miss it. So how do I know this? How do we know this? I wrote him in December 2017 and asked him how many times he had read the Book of Mormon. His answer was once. At that point, more than 45 years ago. Once. Okay, so he arrived at these conclusions, these opinions, from a single reading of the Book of Mormon 45 years ago in preparing for his dialogue article. So here's part of my 2017 email correspondence with him again. He had read it once. He read it in its entirety when I was doing research for the article published in Dialogue. Okay. Well, he missed a few things in his one and only reading of the Book of Mormon. And to be exact, there are at least 131 correspondences, connections, congruences, similarities, points of evidences between his book, the Maya, and the Book of Mormon. He didn't do his homework. That's just the frank, honest truth. It's a superficial, one-time reading of the Book of Mormon. It's not honest, rigorous scholarship. That's not how I approach review tasks when I review books or papers. And it's not how he should have approached it, but that's what he did. So the question is, did Joseph Smith guess all those 131 connections, or is the Book of Mormon an authentic historical record? I think you don't have any choices. Dr. Cole has also obligingly told us that in about 1840, when Stevens and Catherwood first went to the Yucatan, that literally nothing was known of ancient Mesoamerica. So there were no sources on which Joseph Smith could have drawn for details of ancient Mesoamerica. Therefore, every factual statement in the Book of Mormon is a guess. Okay? And the question is, do those guesses line up with ancient Mesoamerica? I knew enough about ancient Mesoamerica to know that there were a lot of similarities with the Book of Mormon, even without reading Dr. Coe's book, the Maya. So I went ahead and read it 7 times to try to understand the details. And then we used advanced statistical methods to address the question. The question is the Book of Mormon an authentic historical record, or is it a lie? Is it a guess? Is it fiction? Okay, between us, Brian and I have read the Book of Mormon hundreds of times. And as I said, I've read the Book of Mormon 7 times. The Maya 7 times. For purposes of this analysis, we accept the facts summarized in the Maya as true. In other words, we regard them, even though they may not all be correct, we regard that as our bedrock grounding in the truth there. Given his very negative opinions of the Book of Mormon, you simply can't claim that Dr. Coe selected the facts in his book to favor the Book of Mormon. And we compared the facts in the Maya then with facts stated in the Book of Mormon. Facts stated in one book, which are not stated in the other, can't be compared. There's no grounds for doing that. At this point, Brian will take over and talk to you about Bayesian probability.
All right. So my dad already mentioned that we're going to use some fairly advanced statistical methods. It's not so much that these methods are particularly advanced as that they are relatively uncommon. So most statistics, when they're done, are done with what's called frequentist statistics. And frequentist statistics basically are based on the idea of a probability as a long-range frequency. So, you know, if we're talking about flipping a coin and we flip it 1 time, then it may turn out heads or it may turn out tails. If we flip it 10 times, then we may get 7 heads and 3 tails. If we flip it 1,000,000 times, then we expect to get pretty close to about 500,000 of each heads and tails. So that's the idea of a frequentist probability. It's something that you repeat over and over and over, and then you just count what proportion of those wind up being the thing that you're looking at. So one of the weaknesses of frequentist probability is that it's really difficult to address things that only happened once. So you can't really assign probabilities to things that are just a single event that just happened once. Bayesian probability is a little bit different. So Bayesian probability is based on the idea of probability as an indication of how strongly you believe a statement. So if I start with a coin, then before I even flip it, and I haven't acquired any data, I might say, I think it's 50-50 chance that it will turn up heads. So that is a statement of my belief. And that's what Bayesian probability looks at probability as being. Then the Bayesian method is a method for using data to update your beliefs. So as I flip a coin repeatedly and repeatedly, and I start to get more heads, more tails, then I start to get a stronger belief about what that percentage is, what that long-range frequency would be. So Bayesian statistics allows you to update your beliefs. It allows you to express your beliefs quantitatively, express your beliefs in terms of probability, and then rationally update your beliefs as evidence is acquired. So Bayesian probability in this sense, usually when you look in the literature, is more closely related to betting odds, which may not be the best approach for this audience, but in general, the idea is, would you prefer to have a bet on a roulette wheel with a certain number slots marked out for win, certain number for lose, or the truth of whatever probability statement you're making. Now, one weakness that Bayesian probability has is that rational people may disagree. So in particular, that's encoded in what we call our prior belief. So our prior is our beliefs that we go into the data collection with. As Bruce mentioned, we're going to start with a prior that basically reflects not our personal belief, but what we believe our opponents would believe, 1,000,000,000 to 1 against the Book of Mormon being factual. So, Dad, could you go to the next slide? So, I already briefly covered this, but Bayesian probability expresses a degree of belief in an event which can change as new information is gathered. So, for example, this on the right shows we've got this line that's labeled prior beliefs, a line that's labeled evidence, and then our posterior beliefs are a merging of our prior beliefs and the evidence. So, if we had, let's say we went back to that coin example, and maybe, I think it's probably 50% because most coins are close to 50%, but I don't really know this specific coin. So maybe I want to be a little bit cagey and say it's somewhere between 25 and 75%. So I might, in fact, have a graph like this that shows the probability, my prior belief about what I assume based on my general knowledge of general coins this might be. And then as I flip a particular coin and find maybe that it's not 100%, not 50-50, then my beliefs can update and they can get both shifted in terms of what I believe and also narrowed in terms of how uncertain I am about my beliefs. Okay, so that's the idea of Bayesian statistics. We're going to start with some prior beliefs, we'll obtain evidence, and we'll modify our beliefs according to this Bayesian statistics. So the way that this works with a fairly simple dichotomous example, for example, in our case, is the Book of Mormon fiction, yes or no? Other common examples are, do you have a specific disease? So this is kind of, in the literature, the most common example that they use. And so let's take this example of we have a patient, and this patient goes to their doctor, and they're concerned about whether or not the patient has a rare disease. And we know from just basic population statistics that the odds of them actually having this disease is 1,000 to 1 against, just based on the frequency of the disease in the population. So if we order a screening test that has a 90% sensitivity and a 91% specificity, so that means that if they have the disease, it's 90% likely that the test will say they've got it. And if they don't have the disease, then it's 91% likely that the test will come out negative. If we run that test and we find that the test is positive, then we want to use that to update our beliefs about whether this person actually has the disease. So in this case, The probability of getting a positive result if they're healthy is 90%, and the probability of getting a positive result if they're sick is 9%. So the ratio of those two is 10. So this 10 indicates the strength of that evidence from that test. So the 10 is the strength of the evidence from that test, that based on the fact that it's 90% likely to be positive if you're healthy and only 9% likely to be positive if you're sick, then that's a factor of 10. So to calculate our posterior beliefs, how the evidence changes our beliefs, we take our prior, which is that 1,000 to 1, and we multiply it by 10. And so that gives us a 100 to 1 against. And so even after this test, it's still much more likely that the patient does not have that disease. So a rational doctor would hold off and say, okay, we're not going to begin treating for this disease. We're going to order some more tests, and we're going to accumulate a preponderance of evidence. Okay, so that's the idea of Bayesian statistics. So what we're going to do in our work is we're going to test this proposition, the Book of Mormon is a work of fiction. So we'll assume that it's fiction, not because we personally believe that it's fiction, but because that's what our opponents would believe. And so we want to do something that would be as convincing as possible to a reasonable opponent. So we'll start with some insane odds, 1 billion to 1 that it is a work of fiction. So to put that in context of Bayesian statistics, what we're saying is I wouldn't accept a bet that is true unless you would offer me $1 billion for a $1 stake. So I wouldn't take a bet unless it was 1 billion to 1. So I wager $1 and you wager $1 billion. That's the only way that I would take the bet that it's not fiction. Okay, so that's what we're saying. This is my personal opinion, but my personal belief is that if somebody won't, if they're so skeptical that they won't accept 1 billion to 1 odds, chances are that they're just not going to be rational anyway. So this is about the most extreme that we could put what we believe a skeptical but rational person would have as a prior. All right. So if it's a work of fiction, then every fact in the Book of Mormon is a guess, and so we're going to assume that the facts in the Maya are true, and we're going to rate everything by the likelihood that Joseph Smith would have to guess that fact. So that's going to be that factor of 10 that I showed in the previous slide. So we're going to look at each thing as an individual test, and we're going to rate the strength of that test in a scale. And that will, as we repeat that over and over, that will allow us to increase or decrease the numerical value of our belief. So it will allow us to change these odds. All right. Next slide. So the approach that we took is that my dad in particular read both books, and as he was going through, he accumulated political, social, cultural, religious, military, technological, and geographic facts. So all of these different types of facts, and looked at the facts that are identified in both books. Now, the reason we needed to have facts that were identified in both books is because if a fact is stated in both books, then we know both authors' opinion. We know the fact as the Maya has, and we know the guess by Joseph Smith. If a fact is stated in the Maya but not in the Book of Mormon, then we have no basis for assuming what Joseph Smith would have said, whether he would have guessed right or wrong. Similarly, if a fact is stated in the Book of Mormon but not stated in the Maya, we have no way of saying what Dr. Coe would have said. So we're only going to compare facts that are stated in both, and we're going to check them to see if those facts agree or if they disagree. And we'll rate each of these according to the strength of the evidence. So things that have strong evidence are facts that have a low probability if Joseph Smith was writing a book of fiction, and a high probability if they're not fiction. Weak evidence would be facts that have a high probability if it's fiction, and also a high probability if it's nonfiction. So in other words, we can assume that whether the Book of Mormon is fact or fiction, or the Maya is, that they both agree about things like people ate food. Obviously people eat food. So that is weak evidence because it has a high probability if it was fiction, it has a high probability if it's nonfiction. So the things where you have strong evidence are where it's a low probability of fiction and a high probability of nonfiction. So that's the important thing. Those are the things that we're looking for when we're categorizing the strength of the evidence. All right, next. So we used this scale for setting up what we call the strength of the evidence. Correct guesses have numbers that are less than 1. Incorrect guesses have numbers that are greater than 1. So incorrect guesses make those odds smaller. Remember, we started at a billion to 1. And incorrect guesses make those odds even larger. So each time we have a fact, we'll multiply the strength of that fact, this is the likelihood estimation, by the odds that we have at that point in the chain. And this also means that if we have conflicting evidence, we can actually handle conflicting evidence with this approach. So when we have conflicting evidence, we don't have to just throw up our hands and give up. We have a specific way that we can combine those. So essentially, one bad guess and one good guess will cancel each other out. That's a way to deal with conflicting evidence. And so if we have those, then we won't have any change in our prior belief.
So I'll take it from here. The numbers that Brian cited just a moment ago are not arbitrary. We didn't just make those up. They're taken from published values of the Bayes factor. It's found in this particular reference, 1995 Journal of the American Statistical Association. These authors, it's entitled Bayes factors, page 777, which is interesting. So again, the three different strengths of the evidence for the hypothesis being the Book of Mormon is a work of fiction, of Bayes factors 2, 10, and 50. And for the converse hypothesis, that it's an authentic book, 0.5, 0.1, and 0.02. And again, in each case, 0.5 times 0.2, or 5.5 times 2 is 1, 0.1 times 10 is 1. They cancel out. One strong guess for and against cancel each other out. The Bayes factor also has, or Cass and Rafferty also use what they call a decisive number, where it's greater than 100. We didn't use our analysis. We now allowed no guess to be decisive one way or the other. Although we think that there are actually guesses or facts stated in the Book of Mormon that are so strong that you could regard them as decisive, but we don't allow any number to be higher here than a Bayes factor of 50. Okay, and the Cass and Rafferty point out that these are a rough descriptive statement about standards of evidence in scientific investigation. Now, this is interesting because we can compare that with the evidence project burden of proof, according to Jack Welch. And it seems to me that this is a fruitful way of perhaps quantifying these burden of proof hierarchies per Jack Welch. Worth mentioning, Bayes factor of 2, categories 1 and 2, substantial, Bayes factors of 10, probable, preponderance of evidence, strong, confident, substantial, clear and convincing, almost certain. And then decisive, again, we didn't use it, but Jack Welch points out here, the evidence project, this is beyond a reasonable doubt, dispositive, practically certain. Multiple parameters become a convenient convergence. And we didn't use that, but we certainly believe that there are categories of evidence in the Book of Mormon that would rate that. For instance, the presence of the poetic parallelism. I would rate, as a physical scientist, the detailed description of a volcano and associated earthquakes at chapter 30 by chapter 8. I think that is beyond a reasonable doubt, dispositive. Okay, here's how we assign correct, good, and great, also incorrect, bad, and gruesome guesses. Again, correct, good, and great guesses. Is it specific? Is it clear that the guess in the Book of Mormon is directly comparable to statement of fact in the Maya? That's a correct guess. 1 out of 2.5. Specific and detailed. Are there important details in each guess that correspond to details in the Maya? That's a good guess. Is it specific, detailed, and unusual? Is the statement of fact in the Book of Mormon or guess unusual in the sense that someone writing the book in the early 1800s probably wouldn't have the knowledge to include that as work of fiction? That's a great guess. Okay, 1 out of 50.02. And corresponding for incorrect, bad, and gruesome guesses, specific but wrong counts against the Book of Mormon. Specific and detailed but wrong counts 10 to 1. Those provide details. And is it specific, detailed, and unusual but also wrong? That's a gruesome guess, a 50 to 1 odds. And the kind of gruesome guess would increase the weight of the evidence by a factor of 50. In other words, you multiply the billion to 1 by 50, and you increase the weight of the evidence against the Book of Mormon. Here are, to illustrate, here are 3 guess strengths. A correct guess: both the Book of Mormon and the Raya refer to the practice of repopulating older abandoned cities. And it's correct, but it's not particularly strong. We give it a strength of 0.05. A good guess: the existence of highland and lowlands. Coe's book emphasizes highlands and lowlands, and the Book of Mormon does too, if you assume that go up and go down mean to ascend and descend in elevation. We believe that's correct. A great guess is what I mentioned earlier, 3rd Nephi chapter 8. We gave that a strength of 0.02. I think it's actually practically certain. In other words, that the Book of Mormon had to occur in country, part of the world where there were earthquakes and the associated volcano-associated earthquake. And it's just an excellent guess. Hugh Nibley pointed out a long time ago, and Jerry Grover more recently, I think, did another very good job there. So we recalculate our initial hypothesis. Brian, point that again. The probability of the new belief is the probability of the prior belief times the new positive evidence weighted times the new negative evidence also weighted. And again, 1 billion to 1. How likely is it that Joseph Smith guessed all 3 of these facts? Okay, the repopulating old cities, high and lowlands, and also volcanoes. So they're statistically independent. The probability they got all 3 of these right by guessing is the product of those. That's again, Bayesian statistics follows regular statistical methods in that the probability of independent events occurring together are the product of their probabilities. So 0.5 times 0.1 times 0.02 is 1 in 1,000. We would recalculate our belief, new evidence is 1 billion to 1 times 1 in 1,000 equals 1 in a million. Okay. The law's conclusion here, we still think it's much more likely than not the Book of Mormon is a fake, 1 million to 1 on us, but we're less sure before we considered this new evidence. And of course, then the question is that all the evidence we have? No, there's a lot more. In total, we found 131 positive correspondences between the Maya and the Book of Mormon, 33 political, 31 cultural. You can read the numbers here. Here are some example correspondences in each of these 6 categories. For political, that a capital or leading city-state dominates a cluster of other cities. And the way that we did this, and this actually constitutes the bulk of our paper in Interpreter, is Appendix A, where we summarize all 131 of these. We give the correspondence. We give the standard from Coe's book, quoting portions of his book, here from page 51, for example. Clusters of villages and communities organized under a single polity dominated by a large capital village. Okay, and then there's a number of citations here that Coe provides that. It's obvious that the Book of Mormon has the same sort of arrangement. Zarahemla, the land bountiful, on and on, are the same, use that same approach. Cultural, active interchange of ideas and things. Again, Coe's standard, we quote him, and then we quote the Book of Mormon correspondence, and then we provide a justification, our analysis, why we think that warrants the particular weight of evidence that we provide. In religious, here's a good one. Seers and seer stones. Coe points out that the Maya had seer stones, seers and seer stones. They call them Chamin. I don't know how to pronounce that word, but and obviously the Book of Mormon has seers and seer stones also. Military, likewise. Defensive earthworks, you're acquainted with many of these things. Geographical, easy to get lost, very thick wilderness. Coe points out how wild some of the Maya area is. And then a technological calendar kept by day, month, and year, which is, to me, very, very unusual. And he refers to both the long count and the linear count, the night and year. And the Book of Mormon obviously shows day, month, and year calendar keeping also. So again, multiply probabilities of independent events to calculate the likelihood of them occurring together. You know the rolling of the dice. And we applied that same approach here to these 131 correspondences, again, given in detail in Appendix A of our paper, which is supplied to you as part of this as a PDF, a copy of that. If all 131 are statistically independent, then the overall probability or likelihood of Joseph Smith guessing them correctly is the product of their individual probabilities. Of those 131 correspondences, 23 have a likelihood of 0.5, the weakest evidence. 57 we evaluated as having a likelihood of 0.1, and 51 have a likelihood of 0.02. Okay, strong evidence. Probability of guessing all of them correctly is 0.5 to the 23rd. This is the number, 0.1 to the 57 power, 0.02 to the 51st power. And this very, very small number, 10 to the minus 151. Okay, wait, you forgot to count Joseph Smith's incorrect guesses, but we didn't forget. We found 6 statements of fact in the Book of Mormon that disagree with facts as stated in the Book of Mormon, including elephants, horses, iron, on and on. We gave all 6 of these facts the maximum weight of evidence against the Book of Mormon, although we don't really think they may weight that, but it's 50 to 1, the strongest evidence that we give. So just 50 to the 6th power, and this is the number. So we multiply that by the skeptical prior of 1 billion to 1 times this number, get a new number. Now we multiply it by the total weighted evidence provided by all 131 positive correspondences. And this is the result, okay? The probability that the Book of Mormon is a fake, a fraud, a work of fiction, as Coe obviously believes it to be, and others do too. That's the probability the Book of Mormon is a fake or fraud lie, according to this analysis. Okay, how small a number is that? Well, good question. There aren't any easily grasped comparisons. The mass of the smallest known particle is the neutrino. The smallest known particle is the neutrino. It has a mass of about 10 to the minus 36 kilograms. The mass of the observable universe, that universe that we can see, is about 10 to the 52 kilograms. So the ratio of the mass of the smallest particle to the mass of the entire universe is 10 to the minus 88 power, roughly. Okay, that's still many billions and billions and billions times greater than the odds that the Book of Mormon is a work of fiction. Okay, so that's the number. We took then 2 controls. Again, we thank the reviewer for making that, because we think that makes the paper quite a bit stronger. Went through manuscript found and compared it with the Maya, and found 19 positive correspondences that we rate at this number, and 21 negative correspondences. The posterior hypothesis, again, positive times the negative times the prior, is still 1,000 billion to 1, is that the manuscript found is an authentic document saying ancient Mesoamerica. In other words, after the analysis of the manuscript found, we're even more convinced than we were to start with that it's fake, or if it's not fake, it doesn't fit ancient Mesoamerica at all. Okay, yeah. In fact, it's excruciatingly bad fiction. I've scarcely read worse fiction. Okay. View of the Hebrews is not written as a fictional book, but the product of the positive correspondences. These are correspondences with the Maya, and the negative correspondences. The posterior, again, is our negative prior, 1 billion to 1, times the positive correspondences times the negative correspondences. And it's still 20 to million to 1 against the idea that View of the Hebrews is an authentic document set in ancient Mesoamerica. It really didn't change our point of view. Okay. All right, let's see, got about 7 or 8 minutes. Okay. Here's just a few examples of positive and negative correspondences from manuscript found in View of the Hebrews. Manuscript found a few positive. They took hostages of high rank. They ate dogs. There were a lot of cities. And land supported millions of people, which we rated as a strong, good guess. Now, manuscript found negative says they had horses and they plowed with them. Well, Coe says that they never did that. There weren't horses, and nor did they plow with them. But the houses and public buildings had no eligible grandeur. And actually, it turns out that 19 of the 21 negative correspondences for manuscript found versus the Maya are not only wrong, they're gruesome. They're specific, they're detailed, they're unusual, and they're wrong. They're wrong. Okay. In positive, comparing for the View of the Hebrews, the knowledge of an ancient flood, that they laid out roads, ornaments of copper, and that covenants exist between God and man. Negative here, ancestral language of the Native Americans was Hebrew, and there's a number of other negative correspondences. They're roughly equal in number and strength for the correct statements. So the View of the Hebrews may be a more or less accurate view of some group of ancient Indians, but not ancient Mesoamerican Indians, at least as far as that's illuminated by Coe's work. Okay, so how robust are our conclusions? Here are several sensitivity analyses. We assigned the weakest Bayes factor to all 131 positive correspondences. So that we just consider them as evidence, but not strong and not really strong evidence. Recalculated, the likelihood the Book of Mormon is a fake is still less than 1 in 1,000 billion, billion, billion. It didn't change really how we view that Book of Mormon. Another way, a sensitivity analysis you can do, we threw out all of the weakest correspondences, and this is one of the suggestions by one of the commentators to our article. We threw out the weakest correspondences, which is 0.5. We downgraded the good to correct and downgraded great to good. In other words, all the 0.5 were thrown out. All the good were just downgraded from 0.1 to 0.5 and great from 0.02 to 0.1. And it's still, the likelihood the Book of Mormon is a fraud is still enormously small, very, very small. So a question you can ask is, how many positive correspondences do you need to change your skeptical prior of 1 billion to 1, the Book of Mormon is the work of fiction, to a positive posterior of 1 billion to 1, that the Book of Mormon, in fact, is an authentic ancient record? And the answer is 17 out of those 131. You need to accept that they're assigned weights. Okay. So it's essentially a factual record. Now some summary, because I think this is worth going over. Dr. J.B.S. Haldane, who's a great British biologist, once said that prejudice is an opinion arrived at without considering the evidence. Book of Mormon scholarly critics ignore a very large body of evidence. I don't know of any exceptions to that rule. Okay, they approach the Book of Mormon with deep prejudice. Dr. Cole read the Book of Mormon once in 1973. It's a totally inadequate scholarly effort. So he missed a few things. From our paper, while Dr. Cole was a great Mayanist, his knowledge of the Book of Mormon is just appallingly deficient. He didn't pay the price that any scholar needs to pay to offer a credible opinion. He didn't know the Book of Mormon. There are 131 correspondences at least. In this article that we wrote, we cited 151 separate pages of his 9th edition of the Maya, which has roughly 280 pages of text. Well over half of the pages of Coe's book contain facts that correspond to facts referred to in the Book of Mormon. If you carefully read the Maya and the Book of Mormon, I think you can't avoid noticing the many correspondences between the two books. They're just so obvious. Third, then Dr. Coe's opinion that, and this is quoting him from his 1973 dialogue article, the picture of this hemisphere between 2000 BC and AD 41 presented in the Book of Mormon, has little to do with early ancient Indian cultures. It's simply not supported by the evidence provided in his own book. That statement is not supported by the evidence that he provides us. So we find that early Mesoamerica has a great deal to do with the Book of Mormon, a very great deal to do it. And we feel very strongly that the cumulative weight of these correspondences analyzed using Bayesian methods provides what is effectively overwhelming support for the historicity of the Book of Mormon as an authentic factual record set in ancient Mesoamerica. Now, let me just address this issue. What's the specific geographical setting of the Book of Mormon? We didn't set out to answer that question, and perhaps we haven't answered it here. We're not interested, Brian and I are not interested in controversy, we're only interested in facts. As far as we're concerned, though, the facts, as summarized in Dr. Coe's book, provide overwhelming evidence that the Book of Mormon is an authentic factual record set in ancient Mesoamerica. And if there are some other plausible explanation or setting, would need to have equivalent or greater supporting evidence than what we presented here. And it must include both positive and negative evidence. Thou shalt not be a cherry picker. Okay, so in effect, we believe that the Book of the Maya describes the same world as the Book of Mormon. How did Joseph Smith guess that? The answer, of course, he didn't. The Book of Mormon is an authentic record, we believe, set in ancient Mesoamerica. And this is right on for 40 minutes, so look forward, hopefully, to having some questions from this audience. Thank you very much.
Okay, you might want to turn your presentation such so we can see you a little bit bigger.
Okay.
Oh, excellent. Thank you
For
so
better,
much.
for better or worse, there you go.
I have headphones on so that way I can hear you better, because sometimes when you speak into the larger room where I'm sitting, it's harder to understand everything.
Okay.
So I have a few questions here. First of all, have you considered running a similar analysis on other books about ancient America? And
So just real quickly, yes. The book that I'm currently using, we're working on a second paper. In fact, we've submitted it for publication. And let me just pop off real quick and get the name of that, because I want to make sure I quote it correctly. Okay. Sorry about that. There is a book written by Stanford University Press, and I think it's just called The Maya, and published in 2005. We're comparing that as part of the second paper in our series, in addition to all 9 editions of Coe's book. This was a suggestion by Kurt Magleby at Book of Mormon Central, that our second paper that would be useful would be to say, it's a general feature of correct scientific facts or authentic historical documents that the positive evidence accumulates over time. And Dr. Coe was obliging enough to write 9 different editions of the Maya. Well, I have all 9 of them. I've read them each 3 times. And we've looked to accumulate, see how that evidence accumulates over time. So the answer is yes. And we're doing it with both a single edition of a book published by Stanford University Press and all 9 editions of Dr. Coe's book.
okay, this question, you answered this in the last slide of your presentation, but I'm going to let you restate what your answer is a little bit here. It says, could this method possibly be used to evaluate the likelihood of different geographic settings for the Book of Mormon, for example, the Heartland Theory, Peru, Baja California, etc.?
Yes?
Yeah, let me speak to that. So the short answer is yes. In Bayesian methods, one thing that you can do is you can compare multiple hypotheses. So we, in this, basically just compared 2 hypotheses. The Book of Mormon is a work of fiction, or the Book of Mormon is nonfiction. So that was the 2 hypotheses we were comparing. But you certainly can set up multiple hypotheses and accumulate evidence over all of those hypotheses and wind up with an overall opinion of which hypothesis best fits the evidence.
Okay, thank you. When you first published your paper... Oh,
this is the book that from Stanford University Press, The Ancient Maya, that's also part of comparison to our second paper. So thank you.
thank you. So here's another question. When you first published your paper in The Interpreter, it was met with a flood of comments, both positive and negative. Has the response to your paper prompted you to alter or refine your methodology in any way? Or your conclusions? Either one.
No, the conclusions stand unchanged. One of the things that I would like to do in probably a 3rd paper, and hopefully the last one, nobody's required to write more than a trilogy, are they? It's good enough for Tolkien, it's good enough for me. So the question is independence, the independence of the correspondences. And that was, we think, an important, valid reservation, because some of these correspondences may not be statistically independent. And once we've got this second paper, in the publication, I'll start on the 3rd one and try to get multiple input to look at the how independent all 131 correspondences are. So that would be an update. Brian, did you want to say something at this point?
Yeah, just to confirm, so there were many, many objections. By far, most of the objections that were on that discussion thread were not really valid. But I really feel that the independence objection that was raised was a valid objection. So that's something that we need to pay a lot more attention to. The problem is that if you can make the assumption of independence, then the math becomes very easy. So the math that we described, very approachable, easy to explain, but it also relies on that independence assumption. As soon as you remove that independence assumption, then the math becomes much, much more difficult. And you have to use basically computer simulation methods that are, in some sense, they're just much less accessible and understandable. So it can be done. This sort of thing has been done in the scenario of weighing evidence for a trial. So there is precedent for doing this sort of a more complicated approach, but it is vastly more complicated.
Thank you very much. Next question here. Elephants, horses, iron, steel, copper, refined gold, and silver were items you mentioned that disagreed with Mike LeCaux's book. Do you personally believe that there are other ways to account for these things in the Book of Mormon?
Oh yeah, I'm aware of the. I mean, for instance, I'm reading Glutton, so I read John Sorensen's book 3 times, and that was an effort. I'm aware that there are good answers to all of those, but again, our point here was to simply take the body of information in Dr. Coe's book and compare it with the body of information. In other words, we accepted what he said in the Maya as true, okay, and then we compared the Book of Mormon with that. So, but yes, I think I'm pretty well aware of most of those, and Brian is too.
Yeah, and the other thing is that the approach that we took with those likelihoods inherently includes both. So it includes both the ways that that statement could be arrived at if it were a work of fiction and if it were not a work of fiction. So it's important to understand that those likelihoods are not themselves probabilities, they're ratios of probabilities. So they're the ratio of the probability of seeing that statement if it were a work of fiction to the probability of seeing that fact if it was a work of nonfiction. And you can have many different reasons, many different justifications that could explain why that denominator is non-zero. And that's essentially what all of these explanations for how horses could be described in there and not been found archaeologically. There's many ways that you can explain that, and that would be included in that denominator.
Thank you very much. So here's another one, and this goes back to your question of whether you've written enough papers yet or not. Do you have any plans to run an analysis on Napoleon's late war, like you did on View of the Hebrews and Manuscript Found?
No.
Yeah,
I mean, I could do that, but I don't feel any driving. The Spirit would have to kick me awful hard in the seat of the pants to do this, as I got kicked to do this what I've done. I've read enough. Yeah, never mind. That answered. No.
I appreciate that, yes. I've read part of Napoleon's late law.
We certainly encourage anybody else that wants to do that to go right ahead. Have at it. Yeah.
Okay, here's another one on geography. Geography seems to be a big question thing, and this is the last question I have. Have you done this analysis for a North American location for Book of Mormon?
So let me answer that, and then Brian can mind whatever else he wants. Informally, I have, and what I have, I've watched several videos by main proponents of the North American book, and I've kind of compared their database. Unfortunately, they only consider parallels. They don't look for anti-parallels. And there's a number of anti-parallels, but let me just say, and hopefully without making anybody upset here, in case those folks are listening in.
I do it all the time. I make people upset, so don't worry about it.
Okay, well, I'll just let you have it then. I don't know any other valid explanation for 3rd Nephi chapter 8 than an earthquake and associated volcanic activity. I don't know how else you get those phenomena. And we have not had active volcanoes in North America, Eastern North America, for 100 million years. And the geology is just really clear on that. You can't get around that. I think that fact by itself, and there's others that I could name, simply rules out Eastern North America as a valid place for the Book of Mormon.
It rules it out without using decisive anywhere.
Right. Close to decisive, right. As far as Peru and other things are concerned, I'd have to look at a body of evidence. But again, I don't wish to offend anybody. But if they can do a similar analysis, consider both pros and cons, both parallel, both points of evidence for and against their hypothesis, do something similar, I'll consider it. But until then, I think this is really overwhelming evidence that the Book of Mormon is an authentic record set in ancient Mesoamerica. I don't see how you get around that. So I'd have to see equal or greater evidence.
This last question I have, I think you've already answered this, but it's along similar things. Have you thought to use this Bayesian method to compare the Book of Mormon to the Hopewell Indians?
The which?
Hopewell.
That's Eastern North America. And I rule it out, or near rule it out, again, by the fact that, tell me what else describes a chapter, what physical phenomenon accounts for what happened in 3rd Nephi chapter 8. And Jerry Grover, I think, did a great job of summarizing that. Hugh Nibley, even back in his day, did it. I don't think you can get anything other than a volcano and the associated earthquakes to line up with those facts. And we have not had volcanoes in Eastern North America for hundreds of millions of years. That's a geological fact. Okay, so Hopewell Indians, that's where they were. So, nope, sorry, Hopewell culture doesn't fit.
Yeah, but again, this methodology certainly could be applied to do this type of analysis. You know, that would be, instead of being a, strong evidence for, it would be strong evidence against, but there could be other evidence. And so this sort of analysis is adaptable to pretty much any hypothesis. And so if that's a hypothesis that you have, you can follow the same procedure and come out with an answer. And you can compare different hypotheses and see which is stronger. So it's an exercise that can be done. I don't think we plan on doing it, though.
I really appreciate your time. I appreciate you beaming into us from afar and participating with this conference. And with that, that's the end of our questions, and thank you very much.
Pleasure.
All right, thank you.